to Loom of Dreams. This is a place where stories are woven softly, thread by thread, until they become a blanket of quiet comfort around you. Here we slow down together. We listen, we breathe, and we rest. As you settle into this moment, let your body grow a little heavier, your thoughts a little lighter. The day has done enough. There's nothing left to rush, nothing you need to hold on to, only the gentle rhythm of your breath and the warmth of the evening around you. Before we begin tonight's story, let's take a few moments to settle the body and quiet the mind. If you'd like, close your eyes now. Let the rest of the world fade a little. Notice where you are, the shape of the room, the stillness of the air, the gentle warmth that surrounds you. Now, take a slow breath in through your nose. Feel your chest lift and your belly rise. And then slowly breathe out through your mouth, as if you're blowing warm air onto a window. Let your shoulders drop and feel that breath leave gently, like a sigh. Again, inhale softly, not too deep, just enough to feel the cool air enter. Pause for a moment and exhale slowly. Each time you breathe, imagine the air moving like a wave, in and out, steady and kind. Your body begins to understand this rhythm, the same rhythm as a calm sea at night, the same rhythm as the fire in the hearth. If your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Just notice it and bring it back to your breath, back to the sound of the fire, back to the quiet in your room. Now feel your body growing heavier, your hands resting loosely, your jaw unclenching, your eyes softening behind closed lids. Let your breath find its own pace. There's nothing you need to do. You are safe, you are home, and you are ready to rest. Tonight, we'll travel slowly to a small Norwegian fjord town tucked beneath winter mountains. Snow rests on the rooftops. The harbor is quiet, and in a wooden cottage on the hillside, a young woman named Liv is still learning how to breathe again after leaving the rush of city life behind. One winter morning, a note arrives from her grandmother's old friend in the mountains, an invitation to a hidden hot spring deep in the forest where warm water steams beneath the snow. Liv sets out with Elias, who knows these hills by heart, and Lina, a girl her own age who has never once left the town. Together they walk through fresh snow and silent trees, crossing old bridges and passing frozen waterfalls until the lantern-lit courtyard of the springs begins to glow through the rising mist. Tonight's story is about warmth in the middle of winter, about moving at the mountain's pace instead of the city's, and about the gentle space that opens up when no one is asking you for answers. So, when you're ready, find a comfortable position. Let your body grow heavy and still, and follow Liv up into the quiet hills, where hot water waits beneath the snow, and the night is in no hurry at all. On a winter morning in the little fjord town, the light arrived slowly, as if it had nowhere in particular to be. Overnight, the snow had fallen in soft, patient layers, covering the roof of Solveig's cottage until it looked like someone had draped it in thick white wool. The chimney sent up a thin line of smoke that unfolded into the pale sky, and the world outside the small kitchen window looked still enough that it might have been holding its breath. Inside, the cottage was already awake in its quiet way. The stove in the corner gave out a steady, comforting heat, and the faint crackle of burning wood blended with the soft clink of crockery and the murmuring of water beginning to simmer. Solveig moved slowly around the kitchen, not because she was tired, but because there was no reason to rush. She filled the heavy kettle and set it back onto the metal ring above the coals, listening to the gentle hiss as it settled into place. On the table, a small wooden bowl held a mixture of dried herbs she had gathered over the past summer, sprigs of mountain mint, a few leaves of lemon balm, some delicate chamomile flowers, and a pinch of something darker and woody that gave the tea a grounding, earthy scent. She took a small handful of the herbs and let them fall into the waiting teapot, watching them flutter down like tiny leaves carried on a slow breeze. As she replaced the lid, a faint rattle of glass from the window drew her eye. Frost had traced pale patterns over the inside of the pane during the night, softening the view beyond into a gentle blur of white, grey, and the dark silhouettes of the pines on the hill. The kettle's song grew a little louder, still far from a boil, just a promise of warmth to come. Solveig wrapped her hands around the edge of the wooden table and stood for a moment, listening to the small, familiar sounds of her home, the tick of settling wood, the sigh of the stove. Somewhere upstairs, the faint creak of a board as Liv shifted in her sleep. These quiet minutes before the day fully woke were among her favorites. They were like a gentle pause between one breath and the next. The pause was broken, softly but clearly, by another sound. From the back door came a light, irregular tapping. It was not the sharp knock of a visitor needing to come in from a storm, nor the heavy thump of an arm full of firewood. It was small and almost hesitant, like the sound of a paw striking the wood. Solveig smiled to herself as she crossed the room. When she opened the door, a breath of cold air slipped inside, bringing with it the clean scent of snow and pine. On the step sat the mountain cat that visited from time to time, its fur thick and mottled, its eyes bright and clear. Around one of its front legs, tied gently with a thin length of wool, was a small folded note. "Well now," Solveig murmured, bending carefully to untie the string, "what have you brought me today?" The cat accepted a quiet scratch under the chin as payment for its work, then padded past her into the warm kitchen, finding its familiar place on the rug near the stove. Solveig straightened, the note held between her fingers, and for a moment she simply looked at it, recognizing the rounded, steady handwriting on the outside. The years had softened the letters a little, the ink not as strong as it once was, but the character of the hand remained unchanged. She unfolded the paper, and the faintest hint of cedar drifted up from it, as if it had been kept in a wooden box for some time before being written on. The message inside was brief, but full of quiet intention. It was from Olea, her old friend who lived higher in the mountains, past the second ridge, near a place where the earth, even in deep winter, breathed out warmth through hidden springs. Olea wrote that the hot spring was particularly gentle that day. The steam had risen in a soft, steady column at dawn, and the air above the water had carried that particular quality which she had come to recognize as the mountain's invitation. If Liv felt tired or restless or simply in need of a different kind of air, Olea would be glad to welcome her to the springs for a day of soaking in the warm water, listening to the trees and resting under the watch of the pines. At the bottom of the note there was a small extra line, almost like a quiet thought added after a pause. Olea mentioned that her niece, Lina, would also be there. Lina was about Liv's age, born in the town and raised beneath these same mountains. She had never left the fjord, never taken the long road out to the wider world, and Olea thought it might be good for her to spend time with someone who had. Solveig let the paper rest in her hand for a moment longer, then folded it carefully. Her eyes drifted to the staircase just as she heard the familiar pattern of steps on the wooden stairs, the soft rhythm of a body still half in sleep making its way into the day. Liv appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a wool sweater, her hair loosely gathered at the nape of her neck. Her cheeks were touched with the gentle pink of someone who had just stepped out of a cool room and into a warm one. She blinked once or twice as her eyes adjusted to the softer light of the kitchen, then offered a small, still waking smile. "Morning," she said, her voice quiet and a little rough at the edges. "Good morning, dear," Solveig replied, her tone low and calm. "Come, sit, the tea's almost ready." Liv moved to the table and eased herself onto the bench, folding her hands around the empty space where the mug would soon be. She sat very still, listening to the sounds she had grown up with, the kettle, the stove, the faint hum of wind against the walls. After the harsher, constant noise of the city, these sounds felt as almost something to relearn. Solveig poured the tea and set the cup gently in front of her. As the steam rose, she laid the folded note beside it. "I had a visitor," she said, and there was a hint of warmth in her eyes, the kind that came from an old friendship that had weathered many seasons. "From Olea." Liv's gaze dropped to the paper. For a moment she did not reach for it. Instead, she traced the grain of the wooden table with her finger, following its slow, looping lines. "Olea," she repeated softly. "Is she well?" "She is," Solveig answered, "well enough to be watching the steam from the springs and thinking of who might need them today." She nudged the note a little closer. Liv picked it up, her fingers careful, and unfolded it. She read slowly, her eyes moving steadily over the familiar script. The idea of the hot spring, hidden among the trees, with its rising steam and warm stones, began to form quietly in her mind, like a picture sketched in soft pencil. When she reached the mention of Lina, she paused. "Her niece will be there," she said, half to herself. "About my age." Solveig nodded. "Lina has never left the town. All her paths circle these hills. I think Olea hopes she might find it comforting to walk a little way with someone who has seen both here and elsewhere." Solveig folded the note again, more slowly this time. There was something in the idea that tugged gently at her. This thought of a girl rooted so deeply in one place that she had never stepped beyond it. It was very different from the life she had tried to build in the city, and yet there was a part of her that had begun to ache for that kind of rootedness. "Do you think I should go?" she asked after a moment, the question soft, almost tentative. Solveig's answer came without hesitation, though her voice remained gentle. "I think," she said, "that a mountain and an old hot spring are kind enough to invite you. It would be wise to listen. And I think," she added, reaching out to rest her hand briefly over Liv's, "that you have been walking with a great deal of weight. Warm water." Solveig's answer came without hesitation, though her voice remained gentle. "I think," she said, "that if a mountain and an old hot spring are kind enough to invite you, it would be wise to listen. And I think," she added, reaching out to rest her hand briefly over Leaves, "that you have been walking with a great deal of weight. Warm water and trees and an old friend's quiet company may help you remember how it feels to set some of it down for a while. Before Liv could reply, another sound entered the calm of the kitchen, the crisp crunch of boots on snow outside, the muffled thud of something being set down near the wall. A moment later, there was a knock at the front door. Just two firm taps, followed by a respectful pause. Solveig moved to open it, and Elias stepped inside, bringing with him a swirl of cold air and the sharp, clean scent of the outdoors. He carried an armful of firewood, neatly cut and stacked, the ends of the logs dusted with powdery snow. His breath misted in the air for a moment before disappearing into the warmer room. "Morning," he said quietly, inclining his head toward Solveig, then toward Liv. His voice, like everything else this morning, seemed to know there was no need to rush. "Morning, Elias," Solveig answered. "You've brought more wood than usual." He set the logs down by the hearth with careful movements, as if he didn't want to disturb the deep, gentle rhythm of the house. "Thought you might need it. The air felt heavier on the way up. It'll be a cold night once the sun goes." His gaze drifted to the folded paper still resting near Liv's hand. "I see your messenger found its way," he remarked, a trace of a smile touching his face. "You've heard from Olea as well?" Solveig asked, though she already suspected the answer. Elias nodded. "She sent word yesterday, asked if I'd come up and help with the fires around the pools and the lanterns along the path. Said the springs were in a generous mood." He glanced again at the note. Looks like she had more than one person in mind. Liv listened to this small exchange with a growing sense of something gently aligning around her. The idea that Olea had reached out to Elias too, that there was a quiet plan forming in the background of the morning, made the invitation feel less like an isolated suggestion and more like a part of a larger, slower movement, one that had begun before she woke and would continue long after she slept again. "She's invited me to the springs," Liv said, voicing it aloud as if to test how the words felt in the room. "And her niece, Lina, will be there." Elias's expression softened. "Lina's a good soul," he said, "curious about everything, even if she's never gone far. I think you'll like her." There was a small silence in which the kettle shifted again on the stove and a log in the hearth settled with a soft crack. Then Solveig spoke, her tone both gentle and practical. "It seems the mountain has made up its mind for you. Elias will be going, Lina will be going, Olea will be there, and the springs are waiting. You need only decide whether you want to walk with them today." The decision did not feel heavy. It did not press on Liv the way choices in the city often had, demanding pros and cons and schedules and careful calculations. It felt instead like stepping into a stream that was already flowing in a clear direction. "I'll go," she said softly after another small sip of her tea. The warmth of the herbs spread down into her chest, and the words settled inside her with the same gentle heat. I'd like to go. Solveig smiled, a quiet curve of satisfaction. Good, she replied. Then you should finish your tea and change into something warm. The snow will be deep on the path. The rest of the morning preparations unfolded in the same calm, unhurried way. After breakfast, a slice of bread, a little cheese, a spoonful of last summer's berry jam, Liv went upstairs to dress. She chose the clothes not for how they would look, but for how they would feel against the cold. Wool underlayers, thick socks, a sturdy sweater, and the winter coat that had carried her through more than one long season. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, pulling it high enough to cover the lower part of her face, and slipped her hands into gloves that Solveig had knitted, the stitches tight and reassuring. Before she left the small attic room, she paused by the window. The town lay below, half veiled in a soft mist rising from the fjord, its rooftops rounded with snow, the chimneys sending up thin plumes of smoke straight into the still air. It looked both small and complete, contained within the circle of the surrounding hills. For a moment she simply watched, letting the quiet settle into her. Back downstairs, Elias had prepared his pack. The brass lantern hung from one side, its glass clean, the wick inside waiting for the time that day would begin to lean toward evening. Solveig handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth, some bread, a little cheese, a few dried berries, just enough for a simple bite along the way if they needed it. Liv put on her boots by the door, feeling the familiar stiffness of the leather give slightly as she pulled them snug. Solveig helped her with the last button of her coat, fingers moving with the practiced ease of someone who had fastened that same button many times before on many different winter mornings. "You'll be back before dark," Solveig said quietly, not as a question, but as a gentle anchor. "I know," she replied. "Thank you." Their goodbye was simple, a brief hug, a hand resting for a moment on her shoulder, a soft "go on then," spoken with warmth and no trace of worry. Outside, the air greeted her with a cool, clean touch on her cheeks, the snow underfoot compressed with a soft, steady sound, not a harsh crunch, but a dense, reassuring give. The air was pale and even, the sky somewhere behind the gray, spreading its life across the town in a gentle, diffuse glow. As she and Elias walked down the path from the cottage, the town unfolded slowly around them. The houses, built of weathered wood, leaned comfortably against the landscape, their windows trimmed in colors that had faded just a little over time. Frost had drawn fine patterns on the glass, turning the panes into something like lace. Smoke from the chimneys drifted upward in quiet columns. Down near the harbor, the masts of the boats formed a small forest of vertical lines against the horizon. The water itself was mostly still, edged with thin ice that caught the light and gave it back in a softened shimmer.
The air carried the faint scent of salt from the fjord and the sweeter smell of wood smoke from stove and hearth. Here and there, other people were beginning their day. A woman shook a blanket over her porch railing, the motion slow and deliberate. A man carried an armful of logs into a shed, pausing to nod a greeting as Liv and Elias passed. Two children, bundled in thick coats, rolled snow into uneven spheres, their laughter muted by their scarves and the open space. The town's main street was not busy. It rarely was in winter. But there was a steady sense of waking, of life quietly adjusting itself from night to day. Every movement seemed to belong to a rhythm that respected the season's slower pace. At the edge of the town, where the last houses gave way to the first line of trees, a simple wooden post marked the beginning of the forest path. Snow had piled on its top, forming a small perfect dome. It was here that they stopped to wait for Lina. Elias adjusted the straps of his pack, making sure the lantern was secure. For a moment they stood in companionable silence, looking back at the town behind them, and then ahead to where the forest path began its slow climb upward between the trunks of the trees. The air was very still. The only sounds were the soft shifting of their clothing, the faint whisper of wind moving high through the branches, and the occasional distant call of a bird. Liv felt time thickening slightly around them, each second stretching out and relaxing. Of the town and the first row of trees, she sensed that the day was gently divided into two parts. The world she had known all her life below, with its wooden houses and fjord and familiar routines, and the quieter, more mysterious world that waited above, where steam rose from hidden springs and the mountains spoke in warmth and water. Elias glanced at her, his expression calm. "Lina will be here soon," he said softly. "She knows this path better than anyone." Liv nodded. "I'm ready," she replied, and she found that she meant it, not with any excitement or urgency, but with a quiet acceptance, as if she were stepping into something that had been waiting for her at just this pace on just this morning. As they waited for the sound of Lina's footsteps on the snow, the lantern at Elias's back swayed a little in the still air, catching the pale light of the winter day and holding it for a moment, like a small promise of warmth to come. They did not have to wait long at the edge of the town. The snow held the sound of footsteps until the very last moment, so that Lina seemed almost to appear out of the whiteness itself, a small figure moving purposefully along the last stretch of road. She wore a thick coat, the color of moss beneath snow. Her scarf wrapped twice around her neck, the ends tucked neatly into her collar. A wool hat covered most of her hair, but a few strands had slipped free and caught the cold light like fine threads of copper. As she reached them, her cheeks were flushed from the chill and from the small climb up from the lower streets, and her breath rose in steady white clouds. "Sorry if I'm late," she said, with the faintest hint of a laugh in her voice, though she was not late at all. The snow was too pretty not to walk slowly. "You're just in time," Elias replied, his tone as even and unhurried as the morning itself. "The forest path is waiting." Lina's gaze moved briefly to Liv, and there was a quiet curiosity there, but no awkwardness. She smiled, the sort of gentle, open smile that made it easy to stand beside her. "You must be Liv. I've heard about you from my aunt. I'm glad you're coming today." Liv returned the smile, feeling something in her shoulders loosen a little. "I'm glad too," she answered. "It's been a while since I walked this far into the hills." "Well," Lina replied, turning toward the trees with the familiarity of someone greeting an old friend, "they remember you, even if you've been away." With that, the three of them stepped from the last traces of town onto the forest path, and the character of the day changed almost at once. The brisk openness of the houses and harbor gave way to a quieter world, one framed by trunks and branches and the gentle rise and fall of snow-covered ground. The path itself was easy to see, even beneath the fresh snowfall. It wound between the firs in a line that many feet had pressed into something steady over the years. The snow that covered it was new and light, fallen during the night like sifted flour, and every step they took pressed into it with a soft, muffled sound. It was not the sharp crunch of deep frost, but a subtle, cushioned tap, as though they were walking on a thick blanket laid over the earth. The sound was so gentle that it blended into the stillness instead of breaking it, each footfall like a small, measured stroke of a brush on velvet. Liv became aware of that sound almost immediately. It seemed to set the tempo for their progress, slow and regular, and after a while she noticed her breathing falling into that same rhythm. The air here was cooler than in the town, but it had a different quality. It felt cleaner, touched with the sweetness of resin and a faint metallic brightness of distant water frozen under snow. The fir trees rose on either side of them, tall and patient, their branches carrying heavy, rounded pillows of snow. Every now and then a small cluster would surrender to gravity and slide off, falling in a soft, muffled sweep that sent a faint tremor through the branches. When that happened, the air momentarily filled with fine, swirling flakes that caught the light like dust in a sunbeam before settling quietly back onto the ground. The path began to incline, almost imperceptibly at first. Their bodies leaned into the slope in a natural way, their steps shortening slightly as the hill grew more pronounced. Lina moved to the front without needing to be asked, her boots finding shallow depressions in the snow where the ground was most secure. She walked with the assurance of someone who had taken this path in every kind of weather at every time of year. Occasionally, she reached out to brush her mittened hand against the bark of a familiar tree, or to gently clear snow from a low branch that dipped over the trail, as if greeting each part of the forest in turn. "That fir on the left," she said quietly, tilting her head slightly toward a particularly tall tree whose trunk bore a long, spiraling scar, "was struck by lightning when I was small. It looked half dead that summer, but the next spring it grew new shoots from the scar. My aunt said the mountain decided it wasn't done with it yet. Liv glanced at the tree as they passed. The scar wound up the trunk like a faded memory, but the branches above were full and dark, steady beneath the snow. There was something reassuring in that, in the thought that even after being split by sudden fire, the tree had simply gone on growing. As they climbed, the forest opened occasionally in narrow gaps where the trees thinned just enough to allow a view of the fjord below. The snow-covered branches framed those glimpses like the edges of a painting, and each time they looked out, the world beyond seemed to have shifted a little more into wakefulness. The thin mist that had hovered over the water earlier was beginning to lift now, rising slowly from the surface in pale ribbons. The fjord looked almost like a great animal breathing, exhaling mist, inhaling cold light. On the first of the larger hills, the path grew steeper, and the three of them moved with greater care. The snow here was slightly more compacted where the slope had shed its newest layers, and their boots made a faint, steady squeak against it. Their bodies warmed with the effort, and soon Liv could feel a gentle heat building beneath her layers of wool, her heartbeat deepening in her chest in a way that was not strained but strong. They reached the crest of that first hill together, their steps slowing naturally as the ground leveled out. The trees opened in front of them, and for a moment the sky seemed larger. From here, the view of the fjord was clear and wide. The mist lay in soft bands above the water, rising and thinning as the pale winter sun, still hidden behind gauze-like clouds, offered just enough light to turn the surface a muted silver. The houses of the town were now small and clustered, their smoke rising in straight, narrow lines. The boats at the harbor looked like careful strokes of ink on a white page. Liv stood for a moment and simply watched. The air at this height felt different, perhaps thinner, or simply more full of quiet. Behind her, the forest was a wall of soft green and white, and before her, the fjord and town lay like a memory she could see, but no longer felt trapped inside. The sense of being pulled in two directions that had followed her since returning from the city eased slightly, as if the act of moving upward had also given her thoughts a place to settle between here and there.
It's always like this after fresh snow, Elias said in a low voice beside her, not wanting to disturb the quiet of the moment. The mist rises slowly, and the town looks as though someone tucked it in for the day. He had walked this path many times, alone, in all the seasons. As they resumed their climb, he began to share little pieces of that familiarity, not as stories to impress, but as small markers that might help Liv and Lina understand the mountain in the gentle way he did. Up ahead, he said, there's a fallen birch on the right. It's been there for years. In summer, mushrooms grow along its length, like buttons. In heavy snow, you barely see it unless you know where to look. True enough, a little further on, a long, smooth trunk
lay parallel to the path, half buried under a soft mound of white. Only the slight curvature of its form and the pale bark visible near the exposed end betrayed its presence. Lina reached out to tap it with the side of her boot, a habitual gesture that made it seem almost like an old friend they were greeting on the way. Further up, Elias went on after a time, the wind changes. You'll feel it. It comes from the other side of the ridge, from deeper in the mountains. It has a different sound. Liv listened for it as they walked. The forest sounds were all around them, but none of them were intrusive. The whisper of branches moving under their snow, the faint tapping of something small, perhaps a bird working at a hidden patch of bark, the occasional soft rustle from beneath the surface of the snow where an unseen animal shifted in its burrow. Her heart, still a little quicker from the climb, began to fall into step with these sounds. Each inhale matched the length of several footfalls. Each exhale seemed to release into the space between the trees. The more she listened, the less separate she felt from the world around her. The boundary between her own breathing and the quiet breathing of the forest grew thin. It wasn't that she disappeared into it. Rather, she sensed herself as one small pulse among many, steady and unhurried. They moved onward like this for some time, the three figures threading their way through the trees, their path marked only by the soft impressions left in the new snow. The light shifted gradually as they climbed, the sky above them becoming a little more open in some places, dimmer and more enclosed in others where the branches leaned in close. Eventually, the path brought them to a place where the forest changed shape again. The ground sloped downward into a shallow dip, then rose on the opposite side in a gradual incline. At the bottom of this dip ran a narrow stream, mostly hidden beneath a covering of snow and ice, only its presence betrayed by a faint, continuous murmur and the slight unevenness of the ground. Here, an old wooden bridge stretched from one side of the dip to the other, built at a time when passage over the stream would have been difficult without it. The bridge had stood for many winters. Its planks were worn and darkened, and its simple railings bore the marks of countless hands that had rested there for balance, or paused to look down into the water below. Snow had gathered on the bridge in a soft layer, smoothing the edges of the wood and filling the gaps between the boards. As they set foot upon it one by one, the structure responded with a low, expressive creak, not complaining, but speaking in the long, drawn-out tones of old timber, shifted gently under weight it knew well. The sound carried up through their boots into their bones, a reminder that the bridge was alive in its own slow way, flexing and relaxing with every season. Lina walked ahead, her mitten brushing lightly along the railing. When I was very little, I used to think there was something living in the bridge, some quiet spirit that liked to know who crossed. I still tap my hand on it sometimes when I pass, like saying hello. She did so now, a small affectionate pat on the railing as she reached the middle. Liv found herself doing the same, the gesture feeling surprisingly natural. The wood beneath her glove was cold but solid, and there was a sense of continuity in touching something that had been here long before she had returned to the town and would remain long after. From the center of the bridge, the view changed again. The stream below, though largely hidden, showed small openings where the ice had not fully formed, and in those narrow gaps the water moved with a dark, steady persistence. Snow hung over the edges like curtains, and icicles formed in delicate clusters where the water's breath had frozen in place. The sound of it, low and constant, was soothing, like a voice murmuring at the edge of hearing. Beyond the bridge, on the upward slope, the path bent slightly to the left, where the land rose in a small rocky outcrop. Here, the stream that ran beneath the bridge widened into a feature that the villagers simply called the falls. In winter, the waterfall was not a rush of liquid silver as it was in spring, but a frozen curtain of ice that clung to the rock face in thick, layered sheets. As they approached, the frozen falls came in full view. The ice had formed in long vertical drifts, pale and luminous, with variations of white and faint blue that looked almost like strokes of translucent paint laid carefully over the dark stone beneath. In some places, the surface was smooth and glassy, reflecting the light in soft, muted glimmers. In others, it was textured, ridged with the memory of movement, ripples and folds that spoke of the water's path before the cold had persuaded it to hold still. The air near the falls felt different. It carried a sharper chill, as if the presence of so much concentrated cold had deepened the winter in that small hollow. Yet the beauty of it warmed something in Liv even as the air cooled her cheeks. They stopped at a comfortable distance, close enough to see the details of the ice, far enough to take in its whole shape. The frozen water looked almost as if it might begin to move again at any moment, resuming its downward journey in a slow, graceful flow. In the faint light, the pale blue within the ice seemed to glow softly, hinting at the depth and density of the frozen mass. Lina watched it with the quiet reverence of someone greeting an old, beloved sight. "My grandmother told me once," she said, her voice low and thoughtful, "that a long time ago, before anyone settled in the town, people believed this waterfall was the place where the mountain spoke most clearly. They thought that if you stood here and listened long enough, you might hear it tell you something about your path." Elias smiled slightly. "And what do you think now?" he asked. Lina tilted her head, considering. "I think the mountain speaks everywhere," she answered. "But it's easier to hear here, where everything else is so quiet." She stepped a little closer and carefully laid her gloved hand against the ice at the edge where it formed a small ridge. "I like to imagine," she added, "that each winter's ice holds the memories of the water that flowed here before, layer upon layer, year after year." Liv watched her hand resting against the frozen surface and found herself wondering how many winters this fall had seen. How many times it had frozen like this. How many springs it had melted away to rush and tumble and sing. In that context, the span of her own years, of her time in Oslo, of this brief return, felt both very small and somehow safely contained within something larger.
Elias's gaze lingered on the falls for a moment longer before turning upward toward the slope beyond. "The first time I came this way alone," he said, "I was about your age." His tone was calm, but there was a trace of memory in it, as if he were feeling the echo of that younger self moving along the same path. It was early winter, like now. I'd helped Olea carry supplies up, and she said I might as well keep going to see the springs for myself. He paused, as if letting the image return in clearer detail. "I remember the way the steam looked against the snow when I first saw it. It felt strange at the time to find such warmth in the middle of so much cold. I didn't quite believe it until I put my hand in the water. After that, it was different. The mountains weren't just something to look at from the town anymore. They had a place to rest in." Liv listened, standing between the frozen waterfall and the path that led higher. The idea of that first glimpse of steam, of warmth rising in the heart of winter, settled into her mind alongside her own anticipation of what awaited them. She imagined a younger Elias stepping out of the trees and seeing the hidden springs for the first time, his life folding that discovery into itself the way a river takes on the color of the stones it passes over. They did not stay long enough at the falls to become cold, but long enough for the scene to imprint itself quietly on their senses. The pale blue of the ice, the low murmur of the hidden water, the way the air seemed to hold its own breath in the presence of so much suspended motion. As they left and continued along the path, Liv found that her thoughts slipped naturally into a kind of gentle comparison between this place and the city she had left behind. In Oslo, her days had been filled with hard surfaces and sharp angles, with the constant movement of people and vehicles and the low, unending hum of activity. Even when she had tried to carve out moments of stillness, there had always been something pressing in at the edges, a timetable, a deadline, the weight of expectation. Here, the pace was different.
Each step was a choice, not a race. The air smelled of snow and pine and stone instead of exhaust and coffee and wet pavement. Her footsteps, instead of getting lost in the roar of traffic, made their own soft rhythm against the quiet ground. In the city, her heart had often felt like it was beating too quickly, trying to keep up with a rhythm that did not belong to it. In the forest, with the snow beneath her boots and the old trees watching silently overhead, that rhythm had begun to slow, aligning itself more closely with the unhurried pulse of the land. It wasn't that one world was entirely wrong and the other entirely right. She knew that the city had given her other kinds of knowledge, other forms of strength and independence. But here, climbing this path between snow-covered trunks, feeling the air shift as they moved deeper into the mountain, she could not help noticing how much easier it was to breathe. Each inhale felt full and quiet. Each exhale felt like something softly released. Lina's footsteps remained light ahead of her, sure and unforced, as if her body had long ago learned the contours of this path by heart. Elias walked at a steady pace just to the side, neither rushing them nor slowing them, his presence as calm and grounding as the lantern at his back. Together they moved along the trail, leaving behind the bridge and the frozen falls, carrying those images with them like small luminous stones in their pockets. The forest thickened again around them, but now the air held a new quality, a faint hint of a different warmth somewhere ahead, like the promise of another kind of breath rising from the heart of the mountain, waiting patiently for them to arrive. As they left the frozen waterfall behind, the slope grew gentler for a while, and the trees seemed to lean in a little closer, as if listening to their footsteps. The forest was still full of winter, but there was a subtle change in the air ahead, something that did not quite belong to snow and ice. It was felt first as the faintest softening of the cold, a whisper of warmth on the face when the wind dropped. Then there was a scent, not strong but unmistakable, damp wood, mineral-rich water, a trace of something like warmed stone. The path curved around a low rise, and beyond it the land seemed to open just a little. Here the old pines gathered in a loose ring, their trunks dark and straight, their roots gripping the sloping ground as if they had been holding the mountain together for longer than anyone could remember. Between their tall forms, the first delicate threads of steam became visible, rising in thin, wavering lines that drifted upward and dissolved into the branches. As they stepped closer, that steam grew thicker, folding itself into the air in slow, curling shapes. Lantern light flickered somewhere within it, muted and golden, so that the mist seemed lit from inside. The wooden courtyard of the hot springs revealed itself gradually, as though the mountain were unveiling it one careful layer at a time. The springs had been built not as something separate from the forest, but as an extension of it.
Dark wooden walkways crisscrossed the clearing, raised slightly above the ground and curving around the pools they served. The planks were damp from the rising warmth, and a fine sheen of moisture caught the lantern light, giving the boards a soft, reflective glow. Snow lay just beyond the edges of the deck, forming quiet drifts beneath the pines. But inside the courtyard itself, the warmth from below kept the wood mostly clear, the snow melting into tiny beads and rivulets that trickled away through the slates. Around the perimeter, old pines stood like guardians, their branches reaching over parts of the walkways to form natural roofs. Snow piled on their boughs, but nearer the center, where the steam was thickest, smaller trees stood bare and dark, their needles long since fallen under the constant, gentle heat of the springs. Brass lanterns hung from the posts and low beams of the wooden structures, each one holding a quiet, steady flame. As the steam drifted, the lantern light shone through it in pulses, bright for a moment, then softened to a hazy glow, then bright again when the mist shifted. It gave the impression of breathing, as if the courtyard itself lived and exhaled light. Their footsteps changed as they left the snow and stepped onto the walkway, where the snow had received each step with a muffled, cotton-soft sound. The boards returned a faint, hollow tap, slightly blurred by the dampness, as though the wood had absorbed some of the steam's softness. The sound echoed very lightly in the enclosed space, gentle and almost musical. Liv felt the change in her body immediately. The air wrapped around her face and hands with a temperature that was no longer biting, but enveloping. Her lungs seemed to widen as she drew a deeper breath, and the contrast between the cold of her coat and the warm, rising currents around her skin gave her a sense of being suspended between two seasons. It was as if winter had loosened its hold in this one small place. From a low building at the far side of the main walkway, a door opened with a quiet slide, and Olea stepped out to greet them. She wore a thick shawl of deep green wool, fastened with a silver clasp in the shape of a leaf. The moist air had given her hair a slight curl, and a fine mist clung to the edges of her shawl, making it sparkle faintly in the lantern light. Her eyes were bright, and the lines at their corners, etched by years of smiling and squinting into mountain weather, deepened as she looked at the three figures approaching along the planks.
"So," she said, her voice low and warm, carrying easily across the small distance without breaking the stillness. The mountain kept its promise. Elias inclined his head in a greeting that held familiarity and respect. Lina went ahead with a small, contained burst of energy, her boots making soft sounds on the wet wood as she crossed the remaining few steps and wrapped her arms briefly around her aunt. Alea held her close, then let her go with a small pat to the arm, and turned her attention to Liv. "And you must be Liv," she said.
not in the tone of someone meeting a stranger, but of someone finally seeing in person a name that had been carried in stories and letters. Solveig's granddaughter, back from the city and kind enough to visit an old friend's little corner of the mountain. Liv felt a shy warmth rise in her chest. "Thank you for inviting me," she answered quietly. "It already feels different here." Elia's smile deepened as if she had been hoping to hear just such a thing. "Different is often what we need," she said. "The springs woke early this morning. The steam rose in a straight pillar at dawn, and the pines were very quiet. It seemed to me they were waiting for company." She gestured toward a smaller hut tucked to one side of the courtyard, its sliding door slightly ajar. "Come," she went on. "You've walked a good distance. Let the mountain's warmth meet you halfway. There are robes and towels inside. Take your time. The water isn't going anywhere." Inside the changing hut, the air was noticeably warmer, collected and held by the thick wooden walls. A small iron stove glowed gently in the corner, casting a soft orange light that mingled with the paler glow entering through a high frosted window. Benches ran along the sides of the room, smooth from years of use. Neatly folded robes lay in shallow baskets, their fabric thick and soft, and a stack of towels waited nearby, faintly fragrant with the clean, simple scent of sun-dried cotton. Liv removed her coat and boots slowly, feeling the stiffness of the outer layers give way to the more forgiving warmth of the room. The sensation of wool sliding off her arms, the cooler air against her skin, then the comforting weight of the robe as she slipped it on. Each movement seemed to happen with deliberate slowness, as if the place itself were reminding her there was no need for haste. Lina moved easily through the familiar routine of changing, humming under her breath some tune that Liv did not recognize but found soothing. Elias was quiet, efficient, respectful of the small shared space. When they were ready, they stepped out again into the courtyard, now barefoot inside their wooden sandals, wrapped in robes that trapped the warmth of their bodies and shielded them just enough from the cooler edges of the air. The first brush of steam against Liv's ankles and legs where the robe shifted felt like an invitation. The path to the first pool wound gently around a cluster of stones and low shrubs, all half disguised by steam. As they walked, the sound of water became clearer, not the rushing sound of a river or fall, but a muted, steady murmur, like someone speaking softly from another room. The light grew diffuse the closer they came, until the lanterns were seen only as golden orbs hovering in the mist. The first pool itself appeared all at once as they rounded a corner, its surface calm and faintly reflective beneath the drifting steam. It was set into the wooden decking in an oval shape, ringed with smooth stones that were dark with heat and moisture. The water glowed with a soft inner light, reflecting only a hint of the lantern flames. Above, between the gaps in the steam, Liv could see the outline of the ridges, their snow-covered slopes rising like silent watching shoulders against the pale sky. The three of them paused at the edge for a moment, letting their bodies adjust to the new warmth pressing gently up from the water. Then Lina moved first, stepping down the submerged stone ledges and lowering herself into the pool with the ease of someone returning to a familiar embrace. The surface rippled briefly around her, then settled again. Elias followed, his movements careful but unhesitating. The water took him in up to his shoulders, and his expression shifted subtly, some of the readiness in his posture softening into calm. Liv watched them both, feeling the heat on her face, and then she stepped in as well. The first contact of the water around her ankles was almost startling, not because it was too hot, but because it was so different from the cold that had wrapped her feet all morning. As she found her footing on the smooth stone below and eased further down, she felt the warmth climb slowly, covering her calves, her knees, then with a deeper breath and gentle courage, her waist and chest. When she finally sank in up to her shoulders, the heat held her very firmly, but not in a way that trapped. It was more like being supported by something that had been waiting all along. For a few heartbeats, there was a kind of suspended silence inside her. The sounds of the courtyard, the soft drip of water from the rocks, the faint creak of wood as the structure adjusted to the constant warmth, the occasional sigh of wind moving through the tops of the pines, seemed to retreat to the edges of her awareness. All that remained was the sensation of the water itself, pressing evenly around her, reassuring and still. Breath came a little deeper, a little slower. The memory of cold along her fingers and nose began to dissolve. Muscles that had worked through snow and slope released their tightness in small, almost imperceptible increments. The warmth was not just on her skin, but seemed to seep gradually inward, untangling knots she had not known were there. The steam above the pool drifted in soft layers, sometimes thinning enough that she could see the lantern closest to her clearly, sometimes growing thick enough that it blurred into an amber glow without edges. Beyond, the dark shapes of the surrounding trees and the pale outline of the mountain slopes came in and out of view, as if she were seeing them through the steady rhythm of another being's breath. Lina had settled on one side of the pool, her back resting lightly against the warm stone, her head tilted so that she could look toward the line of trees above. When she spoke, her voice was hushed, not because of necessity, but out of natural instinct in such a quiet place. I've been coming here since I was small, in every season, in summer, when the air is full of insects and bird song, and in autumn, when the steam seems to carry the smell of fallen leaves. In winter, like now, it always feels clearer somehow. She paused, letting a small wave of water lap gently against her shoulders. I've never lived anywhere else, she went on, not even for a little while. The farthest I've gone is down the fjord on the boat to the next town, and even then you can still see these mountains behind you." Liv turned her head a little, the water cradling her neck. "Do you ever wish you had gone farther?" she asked quietly. She was silent for a few seconds, considering. "I sometimes wonder," she admitted. "I imagine what it would be like to wake and not see these ridges out the window, to hear different sounds in the street, to walk on ground that doesn't slope toward the water. But I don't know if I truly wish it, or if it's just curiosity. My whole life fits here, between the harbor and the tree line and this courtyard." The steam curled between them as she spoke, dimming the lantern for a moment. Liv let her gaze drift upward toward the outline of the mountain. She thought of the years in Oslo, of buses and trams, of street lights and crowded pavements, of the way the city pulsed at all hours. There had been a strange exhilaration in it once, a feeling of being part of something large and constantly in motion. But somewhere along the way, that same motion had turned heavy, demanding, leaving her breathless more than she knew.
And here, for tonight, we'll leave Liv resting in the warmth of the mountain springs, her heart a little lighter, even if her path is still unclear. In the next episode, we'll return to the lantern-lit courtyard, to quiet conversations about the future, the walk back down through the snowy forest, and the soft, peaceful night that follows. When you're ready, you can join her there and gently continue the story.